Hello again. We're back. Now I'd like to start session 3. And I have the honor of introducing the chair of session 3, Dr. Yoko Tsukuda. Dr. Tsukuda is associate professor in the Faculty of Law at Seijo University in Tokyo. Dr. Tsukuda also serves as a vice president of the Japanese Association for Migration Studies. Holding a PhD in American Studies from the University of Tokyo, she has published on trans-Pacific migration of Japanese as well as post-war experiences of Japanese Americans, especially the contentious relations between US-born descendants of pre-war immigrants and post-war Shin-Issei in San Francisco and beyond.
Just for housekeeping note, particularly for the webinar participants, we're going to open the questions and answer section, both for the floor and the webinar participants at the end of this section. So please place your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar.
Hi, so it's my great honor to be the chair of this session. So I'm going to introduce the first presenter. The first presenter is Andre Kobayashi-Dekro. He's currently a postdoctoral associate in the Heritage Studies and Public History program at the Department of History at the University of Minnesota. He received his PhD from the History East Asia program at Columbia University in 2019. The title of his presentation is Planting Knowledge, Modernizing Agriculture in Japanese Brazil.
Thank you very much, Professor Tsukuda, for the kind introduction. Before I begin, I want to thank Dr. Ueda and the organizing committee here at the Hoover Institution, along with the Japanese Association for Migration Studies, and also a thank you to the wonderful staff here at Hoover for welcoming us and making sure everything at the workshop has run very smoothly and that we're well fed. So good afternoon. I'm Andre Kobayashi-Dekro, or also ohayo gozaimasu to anyone who is joining us from Japan. So today I'm going to give a talk about kind of the reading of Japanese language newspapers with an eye towards agriculture, along with some sort of very specific technical texts and magazines that were written in Japanese for Japanese farmers in the 1920s and 30s. And what I'm going to do today in my talk is I'm going to first give you a sense of what kind of the larger research project is that this is a part of, and how I kind of got to this point and started asking these questions about these texts. And then I'll also talk about a little bit where I hope to kind of place this work that I'm doing in terms of the kind of historiographies of both agricultural development and also the Japanese diaspora. And then I'll move into talking about farmers and agriculture in Japanese Brazil, and then how we might think about agriculture within these Japanese language newspapers, part of which are on the Hoji Shimbun digital collection here at Hoover, and how we can kind of start to look at these newspapers that often don't talk that much directly about agriculture, but as texts that provide agricultural knowledge to Japanese in Brazil. And then we'll talk a little bit, I'll kind of go on to a different source called Nogyo no Burajiru, which is a technical magazine that was published in Brazil, and that has a little bit more information about the specifics of farming, and also kind of the international collaboration that was done between Brazilian state officials who were interested in modernizing farming, and also kind of the Japanese community writ large. And then I'll give some conclusions and kind of tell you the next steps of where I hope to go with the research. And I would very much love for feedback from either anyone, either in this room or joining us by webinar, about maybe where I can go and ask these questions of other sources and primary materials. So the big question is kind of, how did I get here in terms of the larger project? And this kind of grows out of my dissertation project, which is now my book manuscript, which kind of looks at the origins and the implementation of what I consider state-directed Japanese migration to Brazil in the 1920s and 30s within the context of Japanese empire and also Brazilian regionalism and political development. And I'm specifically focused on the state of Sao Paulo. As many of you are likely aware, 70% of Japanese who ended up in Brazil ended up in the state of Sao Paulo, primarily in the periphery of the state. And you can kind of look at this map, which is from a guidebook published by Kaiko, or the Overseas Development Company, of where these were kind of located, these Japanese communities. And so I'm really interested in the development of this this colony-based model within the context of kind of Japanese identity and Japanese interaction with the larger Brazilian state. And in addition, I kind of realized in doing this that a lot of my work really is about the kind of global origins of these elite discourses about Japanese immigration. The ways that both people in Brazil and in Japan were motivated by understandings of kind of modern development and economic progress, and that these are really about kind of certain types of thinkers who, as we've kind of talked about today, have moved around in kind of very rarefied global circles. And part of the work that I do looks at Sapporo Agricultural College, or what later develops into the Hokkaido Imperial University, or Hokudai. And the thinkers that I kind of talk about are, I'm really fascinated in this idea of Hokudai as both a product of Japanese colonialism and also a site of colonial knowledge production. The history of Hokudai, I think, is also really fascinating because it's clearly based, right? If we're all familiar with the history of William Clark and Boys Be Ambitious, right, that this is a history that's based on the American land grant model, and that the efforts of the Meiji government to modernize Japanese agriculture, both in Hokkaido and then also kind of what eventually we see abroad in the Japanese diaspora. In addition, the intellectuals associated with the university, including hearkening back to Professor Garen's talk yesterday, Nitobe Inazo, were part of these global discourses about farm administration, or nose in Japanese, and agronomy during this period, and many studied abroad, received their PhDs in places like Germany and the United States. The person on your right is Takaoka Kumo, who later would become the president of Hokudai. And he was also a very prominent promoter of state-directed Japanese migration to Brazil in the 20s and 30s. And he wrote both for an academic audience, but also in very elite public fora like the Chuo Koron, for example. And so a lot of the work kind of builds off of certain kind of major texts that are looking at the development of agriculture as a science in the late 19th and early 20th century. Deborah Fitzgerald's book, Every Farm a Factory, really talks about how these agricultural schools become places for sort of scientific knowledge production about agriculture. And then Roberto Saba's most very recent book, American Mirror, really talks about how American land grant schools, including Massachusetts Agricultural College, where William Clark went to, really played an important role in the development of a post-emancipation Brazilian agricultural economy that depended on sort of the labor of immigrants to Brazil. And then obviously Professor Azuma's work has been instrumental in kind of showing us how this elite transfer of knowledge kind of happens in the ways that people do this. But I think that one of the issues that I have with this is I was realizing I was reading all of these works about farming, about farms, and how kind of agricultural economies work, but I don't think I could tell you how coffee is grown. I'm reading a lot of sources that talk about people working in coffee. This, for example, is a guidebook from Kaiko from 1932. This is kind of what a picture that you would show a prospective Japanese migrant to Brazil. This is a coffee plantation. After kind of harvest, you have these piles of beans. You also have these large trucks that are going through, but I don't think I could tell you very much about how coffee is picked. And personally, aside from a very short period during the pandemic where I tried to grow some tomatoes, I don't have any sort of like firsthand farm experience. And so this was kind of the big question that I had was, you know, these are the immigration promoters and elites are really talking about farming, but in a very non-abstract way in which we sort of talk about the products of farming, and also I think of farmers or agriculturalists as having a very temporary station in life. And this is, I think, also very much kind of overdetermined by the economic and socioeconomic success of the Japanese community in Brazil, in which the shift has gone away from the majority of the population farming to rather being kind of intellectual, like working more white collar or urban jobs through the post-war period. And so what I'm really interested in is kind of rethinking this idea of Japanese farmers in Brazil. The majority of Japanese who go to Brazil in the 1920s and 30s under the guise of this state-sponsored emigration program end up working on coffee plantations, or eventually kind of growing their own, or buying their own farms and growing their own crops. And we'll talk a little bit about crops in a minute. But I sort of was really wondering what the farmers themselves were doing, and especially how were they economically successful when it comes to growing crops in a place that's very unfamiliar to them and far away, right? There's very few, like no Japanese have experience growing or picking coffee. And then the types of crops that grow in Sao Paulo, there is a lot of emphasis, and I'll talk about this later, on kind of continuity of crops, but there's also just a large number of Japanese colonies and sort of exclave communities that start really growing Brazilian, what we would consider kind of native Brazilian agricultural products. And so this is the big question, I think, is how is this elite knowledge of Japanese, of farming being transferred to the kind of Japanese population? And so similarly, I think what kind of happens is that there's been a lot of work in the kind of community of scholars that look at Japanese Brazil, looking at newspapers, particularly in the field of Japanese literature. And I think that a lot of this emphasis has really been done about showing these newspapers as a means of promoting Japanese culture and identity. And we know that these newspapers had relatively high circulations for newspapers of their size, including in outstate areas of Sao Paulo, presumably among agriculturalists themselves. But in analyzing these papers, especially in kind of the Hoji Shimbun collection, farming is not the primary concern of either the publishers of the newspapers of these, publishers and editors of these newspapers, probably for the same reason why scholars don't really talk about this. It's really difficult to understand and probably pretty boring to read very technical texts about farming. But I was thinking about the methods of Ted Mack, who is a Japanese literature scholar, who's written about Japanese Brazil, and the way that he has kind of read advertisements of bookstores in Japanese text, Japanese language newspapers that kind of show you the types of titles of the reading public in Japanese Brazil. And so what I kind of looked at was also the advertisements and the types of articles and what these articles were telling us about agricultural life and technologies in the Japanese Brazilian context. And one of the main things I realized was that these articles were both informative, telling you what was happening in these communities, but I think they were also deeply aspirational. And I'll talk about this a little bit more as we go through this. But these are kind of the four the kind of ways I think that I broadly categorize my reading of these texts, which is mainly about large macroeconomic trends, and then regional news from other Japanese communities. And then lastly, we'll look a little bit at the advertising that were in these newspapers. So the kind of macroeconomic trends, I think, come up largely when Japanese issues about Brazilian agriculture become too big for the readership of these newspapers to ignore. This is particularly true in the period from about late 1929, after the collapse of coffee prices and the beginning of the Great Depression, to about 1934-35, as the Brazilian government is really struggling with how to deal with fixing a coffee economy that has collapsed, and also sort of very much limiting the economic activity of coffee plantation, both farmers and workers during this period. And so these are kind of examples of, it says, korono, which is the term that was used for Japanese contract laborers on plantations. And this was often the first stage of what was supposed to be this scene of economic mobility for Japanese who are settling in Brazil, that you work on a coffee plantation for a few years, and then you become increasingly wealthy enough to either rent or own your own land and start growing your own crops as you see fit, oftentimes within a colony or an exclave that has a cooperative agricultural agenda. And so there's, but this is very much the treatment of these workers, along with the price of coffee, was instrumental in this kind of economic mobility. The other thing that kind of comes up throughout this is news from other Japanese settlements. Two of the newspapers that are in the Hoji Digital Collection come from the city of Sao Paulo. The other one, Seishu Shimpo, is from Bauru, which is more in the outskirts. But all of these papers, both as a means of gaining kind of circulation, tell a lot about the economic activity of colonies throughout the sort of state or the region that these newspapers are being distributed. And part of the argument that I make here is that these are very much kind of giving information about how certain areas are being economically successful, growing certain types of crops. The other thing that it's also telling you is where you could probably go as someone who might be interested in buying land or in settling in one of these places later on, which leads me directly to these advertisements that are kind of grown, right? I think one of the things that I could kind of pull out of the advertisements, in this case about tools in the Japanese context, about sort of these small tractors, in Portuguese, they kept calling them tractorzinhos, but these are very much tied to Western understandings of agriculture. You can see that this is what kind of European or American tools are for them. These are John Deere tractors, and we'll show a little bit more later, but this is what the mechanization of agriculture is happening. These are stores that are located in Sao Paulo, so people are going there. But this is part of a much larger global conversation about how agriculture and new tractors and tools are being used and imported to Brazil. I think it's always interesting to think about an American company like John Deere exporting products to Brazil to then be purchased by Japanese settlers, right? So this is fairly interesting. But then kind of jumping back a bit, the other kind of advertisements that we see here in these newspapers are advertisements for land and settlement in certain types of colonies or locations. One of the things that we always notice is the type of crops that these types of colonies are growing. And these are different somewhat from the way that these colonies and locations are being advertised in Japan, right? So the idea in these newspapers that these are Japanese Brazilians who are then supposed to buy land in these locations. And these are the same locations that a lot of these, would-be investors would have had information about from the local news, right? So you're getting information both about the economic success of these colonies from the newspapers themselves, but then also these ads are really showing you how and what types of crops are being grown, aside from coffee, even though the first one here is really about like a wonderful coffee growing place, right? So this is really interesting to kind of pull out from the advertisements an understanding of what Japanese agricultural life looked like in Brazil. But this kind of leads then to a source that I found in Japan, and I found a few kind of issues of a magazine called Nogyo no Brasil, and it was published, in Portuguese, it was the Revista de Agricultura Brasileira, and it was published monthly by a place called Centro de Japonês Agricultura, which was based in Sao Paulo, and it appears to have been published from the late 1920s to the mid 1930s. I found these in an archive in Japan, but there's some issues at the Diet Library. I think I've run into a couple issues at the Museo in Sao Paulo as well. But it's not, I don't have a great sense of either what the organization did or how widely these materials were circulated. But the kind of my read of these materials is that we're really looking at local fauna and flora, the information about introducing Japanese farmers to Brazilian crops and also new planting techniques about these crops. And there's also some collaboration, and I can't tell quite how it works, in which the words of Brazilian government officials are translated into Japanese and made accessible to Japanese, to ideally Japanese agriculturalists about new planting methods and new kind of comparisons between different types of crops. And lastly, we see again this mechanization of Brazilian agriculture. So this is some examples that I think are representative of what we see. The first is the coffee borer beetle, something that I wasn't really familiar with. But this is very devastating globally to coffee crops around the world. And this magazine is kind of showing in Japanese, explaining in Japanese how to identify this beetle, also how to treat the beetle. But this is a picture of the beetle itself. that was kind of the first place I've ever run into this. The other one is a tapir, which is kind of a kind of large mammal, and that's native to Brazil. It's actually now in kind of the areas around Sao Paulo, I think it's a species of concern, but these lived in the areas where the Japanese were kind of like tearing down trees to build farms. And so these animals were both seen as kind of a pest and also a novelty, right? So that these are things that you wouldn't run into. Now I think we could all go to a zoo and find a tapir or a capybara, but these are animals that Japanese who are in Brazil would have found strange and possibly a pest of their own. So the article about these animals actually talks about whether or not you can eat them, which is another kind of different thing. And apparently you can't. And the article is very clear that no one does. But the other thing is like moving to kind of a much more technical understanding is that we have kind of new ways of growing crops. These are very technical drawings about how to grow coffee. And then on the right, we have how to grow mandioca, right? Which is manioc root, which is a species, which is a kind of root vegetable that's very popular in Brazil. And so this is kind of the sort of propaganda that might have been available to Japanese migrants in Japan would have talked about this, but this is much more specific into how do you actually grow these crops for, profit. Similarly, like I mentioned before, you have one of these images sort of got flipped or inverted. I don't quite know what happened. But these are Brazilian experts. In this case, the one on the left is Dr. Rogério de Camargo, who is a chief of the coffee section for the state Department of Agriculture, for the Sao Paulo State Department of Agriculture. He later in 1953 wrote a scientific treatise about coffee production called O Café no Brasil, about the kind of industrialization and the promotion of coffee, but his words are being written in Japanese for a Japanese audience about how to grow coffee and be productive doing that. Similarly, the other book is actually, the other sort of text is about tobacco. They wrote a text together in 1930 called Cultura do Fumo. So it's not clear to me whether or not the kind of editors of this magazine are translating kind of existing literature or whether these people are writing very specifically for a Japanese audience. But I think more importantly, it shows kind of the dependency of the state government and later the Vargas government on Japanese agriculturalists to maintain the economic powerhouse that was Sao Paulo agriculture during this period. Lastly, I will just very quickly talk about the mechanization. Again, you have this image. This is a demonstration of one of these like handheld tractors from this period. And so I think in wrapping up, what I kind of want to talk about, what I want to briefly say, is that this literature about agriculture in Brazil is very much both informative and aspirational. I think that we can kind of see that this is the technical things, depending on if you're growing those crops, are telling you how things both work and what you could hypothetically accomplish depending on your economic mobility. I think it also shows the way that Japanese were central to Paulista and Brazilian economic success in the agricultural field, and also how even as the Vargas government grew more hostile in the following 1930, that the Japanese still were vital to the Vargas government's success nationally. And then I think also I kind of hope that I showed some of the global connections of this. In terms of next steps, I want to kind of think about a little bit about how agriculture is an experiential activity, right? We have all of these texts, but the reality is that probably most of the kind of training and agronomy and the agricultural knowledge may have been passed through kind of training programs. And so the question is kind of where can I find other sort of Japanese and Portuguese language sources that talk about this? And I conclude with this image of the seed store ad from the Brasil Jiho. But I think it's really fascinating of the seed store is kind of a place of agricultural knowledge transfer, where this is, right, you can go get new types of seeds, new types of crops for Japanese agriculturalists. And so this is very much something I'm looking at, is trying to figure out who's running these seed stores, who's going to them, how often are they being visited. because I think that this is kind of the type of work that might get us into the very nitty-gritty work about understanding how farming knowledge was produced and exchanged during this period. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre. So for online audience, I'm gonna remind that we're gonna take questions from online audience from this session, and please don't forget include the name of the speakers you wanna ask the question. So I'm gonna introduce the second speaker, the Facundo Julian Garashino. He received his PhD from the Graduate School of Letters, Osaka University, and he's a research fellow at the JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute. The title of his presentation is The Japanese Diaspora as Transnational History, Migration, Development, and Nation Building in the Brazilian Amazon.
Well, first of all, thank you all the organizers for inviting me here. And thank you also all the attendees, whether in person or through the internet, for listening to this panel, this presentation. Well, in today's presentation, I will explore the history of the Japanese diaspora in the Brazilian Amazon from the perspective of transnational history. And I will concentrate on agricultural development by Japanese immigrants in this time in the Amazon region between the 1920s and 1960s. And I think many points made by my colleague Andrew will pop up in this presentation again, so maybe we can return to them in the discussion after. Okay, by doing this research, by this presentation, I aim to elucidate the entanglements between Imperial Japan economic expansionism in the 1920s and 30s, post-war official Japanese immigration programs during the 1950s and 60s, and Brazil's nation building in the Amazon. But first, let me review what the background of my research is to get a better understanding of my argument. You can find the bibliographical references to my presentation in the attached document, which you can find in the website for this conference. Now, my research takes hints from studies that explore how global transformations and connections shape the conformation of the modern nation state. And I think Professor Garon yesterday made a great presentation about this, and much of the authors that he mentioned also, I have read them, and I think I have gained many insights from this type of research. But in the field of a concrete case of a nation building in modern Japan, I consider that empire and nation building were very much intertwined. And in this sense, I take also interest in recent studies that uncover the intersections between Japanese empire building and trans-Pacific migration, such as the research made by Professor Azuma present today. Now, on the other hand, is a large corpus of literature has explored as the central role of immigration for nation building in Brazil, and also the complex place of the Japanese diaspora in this process. Then overall, I think this body of research that I'm referring here demonstrate that transnational migration was central to nation and empire building, both in Japan and Brazil. Well, in dialogue with this, or in contrast with this, my research focuses on exploring how the immigrants navigated these overlapping and often conflicting multiple national and imperial projects which they traversed and inhabited. In this sense, my research raises the following questions. First, how did Japanese entrepreneurs and officials involved in migration-led expansionism deal with the host state's policies of immigration, nation building, or development? And second, how did the immigrants themselves navigate conflicting projects of nation and empire building at the local level? So these questions I would like to address through a couple of examples. To approach these issues, these questions, I will suggest that agricultural settlement and the introduction of new crops by Japanese immigrants to the Amazon functioned as a catalyst for constructing transnational spaces of mediation and cooperation between multiple national projects. More concretely, I will argue that the introduction of jute and black pepper linked Imperial Japan's economic expansionism after the war period, in the post-war international reconstruction through Japanese official migration programs, and finally, nation building under the Brazilian developmental state. So how can we understand the introduction of new crops in the Amazon as linking these three big fields? Well, in addition to these following examples, I suggest this might show some ways in which the Japanese diaspora can be a field for studying the diffusion of crops and agricultural technologies, or the transnational dimensions of nation building itself. So now let's get started with the case studies. Well, looking at the historic origins of the Japanese diaspora in the Amazon, we have to look at the changes in the global flows of commodities. It is estimated that a few hundred Japanese entered the Brazilian Amazon through Peru during the first decade of the 20th century, attracted by the economic prospects of the rubber boom that was occurring at that time in the Amazon. However, larger and sustained immigration flows emerged from the joint efforts of both public and private Japanese agents and the state's governments of Pará and Amazonas. After the rubber produced in plantations of British Malaya and Ceylon replaced the rubber gathered in the Amazon, this was towards the mid-1910s, the local economy of the Brazilian Amazon collapsed. And the government of the states of Pará and Amazonas attempted to reactivate the local economy by attracting foreign immigration and investment through public land concessions. They were especially interested in Japanese immigrants after observing their performance in agricultural development in southern Brazil, which you have already heard from my colleague Andre. But at the same time, in this case, they proposed Ambassador Tatsuke Shichita to redirect part of the immigration flows from southern Brazil to the Amazon in 1925. This was a time when finding alternative destinations for the immigrants was also a priority to diplomats in Brazil, since nationalist sectors were pushing to implement restricted quotas on Asian immigration, echoing the situation that led to the 1924 Immigration Act in the USA. This, in this situation, with the combined efforts of the Pará and Amazonas state governments, the Japanese embassy in Brazil, the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Colonial Affairs, and the sponsorship of prominent Japanese political and business leaders, private colonization companies were established. Today, I will be focusing on two major examples. The first of them is what you see now, the South America Development Company, or in Japanese, Nanbe Takushoku Kabushiki Gaisha, which usually abbreviated as Nantaku, which was established by executives from the Kanebo Cotton Mills Corporation, Muto Sanji and Fukuhara Hachiro, which themselves had experience in working in the textile industry in the USA. Now, the Nantaku built agricultural settlements at the reaches of the Acara River in 1929, about 300 kilometers south of Belém. About 2,200 people emigrated as sharecroppers under a contract with the Nantaku, and although the vast majority of them left due to economical difficulties and the widespread malaria, those who remained laid the basis for what today is the Japanese-Brazilian community of Tomeasu. Okay. The other example is the Amazonia Industrial Institute, or in Japanese, Amazonia Sangoken Kyujo. It was founded by former Southern Manchuria Railway Company employee and Congressman Uetsuka Tsukasa. He obtained leasing rights over 1 million hectares of public lands in the Amazonas state. He created the Amazonia Industrial Institute to research the local conditions and proper agricultural methods for Japanese agricultural colonization of the Amazon. And he also established experimental stations and settlements around Parintins since 1930. This is in the Amazonas state. He also founded the Higher School of Colonization, or Nihon Koto Takushoku Gakko in Japanese, in March of 1931. The aim was to educate what will be the pioneers that will lead agricultural development in the Amazon up until its closure in 1937, The school was involved in sending about 290 immigrants, accounting mostly for the graduates, mostly young males in late 10s, and their families and the spouses, which in most cases they just married and migrated to the Amazon. Now, the businessmen and bureaucrats who supported these companies considered that agricultural colonization would be a means for the empire's economic and national expansion. Importantly, they concentrated their efforts on introducing new crops to the region. Since the 19th century, the global transplant of plants was a central endeavor in the economic exploitation of the European colonial empires. A good example of this was precisely the transplantation of rubber tree seeds from Brazil to botanic gardens and colonies across the British Empire, which resulted in the collapse of the rubber economy in the Amazon. Well, similarly, these colonization companies sought to transplant crops with high global demand and limited supply to fuel mass agricultural colonization of the Amazon by Japanese immigrants as part of this empire's economic expansion. The Nantaku aimed at producing cacao for international markets as a special for North American markets, while also experimenting with the acclimatization of Southeast Asian black pepper, which is the pictures you are seeing here are pictures from pepper trees. And in this case, the Nantaku employee Usui Makinosuke obtained seedlings of the Kuching variant of pepper in the port of Singapore in 1933, which had been themselves transplanted from a plantation in British Malaya. In doing this, Usui obtained the cooperation of a network that connected officials in the Ministry of Colonial Affairs with Japanese entrepreneurs with previous experiences in rubber and pepper plantations in Southeast Asia. On the other hand, the Amazonia Industrial Institute experimented with jute, which was a fiber crop that had a global demand as a packaging material for transporting all kinds of agricultural commodities, but was produced almost exclusively in the Bengal Delta, then a part of British India. Brazil, for example, heavily depended on imported British jute to pack its own coffee production. Then the Amazon Industrial Institute began experimental cultivation in 1931, utilizing seeds obtained with the collaboration of the Japanese consulate in Kolkata and the local office of the Mitsui Trading Company in the same city. Now, reports and propagandistic materials for these companies advertise these endeavors as part of an inter-imperial and interracial contest against the British and American empires. Wetz-Katzkasa, the president of the Amazonia Industrial Institute, compared the Japanese settlements with those of the Henry Ford's rubber plantations in the Amazon, which were also created thanks to a similar land concession granted by the Para state. And Wetzka claimed that transforming the rainforest into a hub for tropical agricultural commodities through Japanese labor would undermine the Anglo-American hegemony on the Western Hemisphere and guarantee the empire's dominance of what he saw as the Earth's last wilderness. However, looking at the context in Brazil of these cases, we have to look that a political regime change during the 1930s led Brazil's federal government to reassert state power in the Amazon. Between the 1930s and 1950s, President Getúlio Vargas attempted to reinvent the Brazilian nation state by stressing development as the center of state policy and the condition for national sovereignty. Especially after Vargas established a centralized and authoritarian dictatorship known as the Estado Novo in 1937, the development of the Amazon became a national crusade. In this context, and with the rise of geopolitical tensions during the late 1930s, the federal government advocated the militarization of the Amazon against the perceived threats of foreign imperialism. Then in this context, the Federal Senate reduced the extension of the land concession granted to the Amazonia Industrial Institute in the name of quote-unquote national security in 1937. Now, this kind of policy by the Estado Novo against ethnic minorities or foreign economic actors is well documented and well researched. Instead, I suggest that we should concentrate in the negotiations and that develop even in these periods of acute conflicts, which can help us to illuminate, as I was saying, the transnational dimensions of nation building. Well, in the same year that the Federal Senate reduced the land concession of the Amazonia Industrial Institute in 1937, pioneers Oyama Ryota and Nakauchi Yoshimasa, which were farming around the districts of Parintins, managed to raise a new variety of jute able to grow in the local environment of the lower Amazon River. The Brazilian federal government took interest in this because it was the first successful example of commercial jute production in the country. At the same time, the federal government was seeking to replace imported strategic materials with domestic production to build an autonomous economy under the prospect of disruptions in transatlantic trade due to the looming war in Europe. We are in the late 1930s. In this context, it took a series of measures that gave the Amazonia Industrial Institute a central role in the production, processing, and commercialization of jute. And as jute production increased between 1937 and 1942, Japanese migration-led expansionism and the Brazilian government developmental nationalism very much overlapped and merged. While Uesca and his supporters affirmed in the Japanese media that they were leading national expansion in the most remote corner of Earth, they stressed to the local Brazilian authorities that they were fulfilling their duties as settlers in bringing civilization and progress to the periphery on behalf of the Brazilian state. Meanwhile, the pioneers that were educated as leaders of the empire's expansion were disseminating jute in the local society. Jute is a very labor-intensive crop, so they needed to employ large quantity. They need to employ the Brazilian farmers and Brazilian families most of the times. So these Brazilian families, these Brazilian farmers, quickly absorbed the new agricultural methods and expanded jute production through the riverside communities of the lower Amazon, well beyond the limits of the Japanese community. And ultimately, with the outbreak of the Pacific War, the Brazilian state appropriated the technologies, capital, and plants which had been mobilized by Japanese migration-led expansionism. The federal government seized the assets of the Amazonia Industrial Institute and imprisoned local managers in 1942. However, it allowed the other non-leaders to remain and continue cultivating jute. But with an increased demand due to the shutdown of plantations in South Asia during World War II, jute became an important crop to smallholder agriculture in the Brazilian Amazon, attaining self-sufficiency in 1952. In the attached document, you can see figures for the production of jute in the Brazilian Amazon. Then, after World War II, Japanese pioneers will become again transnational agents that connected Japanese post-war immigration programs with Brazilian strategies for general development. In this case, I think the production of black pepper in Tomiyasu could be seen as another space for such transnational negotiations. The Japanese farmers of Tomiyasu succeeded in the acclimatization of Southeast Asian black pepper during the years of World War II. And since the early 1950s, the production received a huge impulse from a dramatic rise in prices. Again, you can find figures for pepper production in Tomiyasu in the attached file. Pepper production in Tomiyasu quickly translated into national self-sufficiency in 1955 and the beginning of exportations in 1956. Under these conditions, community building in Tomiyasu, Japanese post-war immigration programs, and Brazilian regional development also very much overlapped and connect. Since the late 1950s, the local leaders of Tomiyasu wanted to increase the number of residents and pepper producers to stabilize the economic and social basis of their community. With this in mind, they sought the cooperation of Japanese agencies and ministries involved in official post-war immigration programs. As we know, since 1954, the Japanese government established immigration programs to South America to palliate a series of economic, employment, and land crises in the rural communities that followed the collapse of the colonial empire. Also, in the context of Japan's reintegration in the post-war international regimes and the global rights of development during the Cold War, the official immigration programs were conceived as ways to regain international trust by contributing to the development of the whole state. In a very similar situation, on the other hand, the Brazilian government considered that the economic development of the Amazon should be based on agriculture as the key to national integration with the advanced capitalist South. Thus, through this kind of multilateral cooperation, a new colony was built, a second Tomiyasu colony, which was inaugurated in 1962. Now, this is another case of cooperation. Now we are reaching the end of this presentation. I believe that the above examples may show that the introduction of new crops in the Amazon by Japanese immigrants could show how different and diverse national projects imbricated or overlapped, while the transplant of strategic crops from Asia to the Amazon was orchestrated by the leaders of endeavors for migration-led expansionism. The Brazilian state was able to mobilize and ultimately appropriate them for its nation building on the peripheries. Meanwhile, Japanese immigrants themselves were able to bring together both the sending and host states and the local society, thus mediating different interests over the production of jute or pepper. And I believe that as Japanese migrants traverse and live in multiple imperial and national spaces, studies on the Japanese diaspora might shed some light on the transnational dimensions of nation building and the role of the diffusion of crops and agricultural technologies in those processes. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Facundo. So we are going to have a last presentation. So the last presenter is Naoko Kato. Dr. Kato received her PhD in history from the University of Texas, Austin, and she is an instructor at St. Mark's College and an information resources specialist at the North American Coordinating Council on Japanese Library Resources. The title of her presentation is Documenting Loss Through the Enemy's Books.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the organizers, the presenters, the chair, everybody who is joining through the online webinar. It's been an incredibly good experience. My talk is entitled Documenting Loss Through Enemy Books. And here I'm referring to the enemy as Japan, the Japanese language books. And by loss, I'm referring to pre-war to wartime Japanese Canadian literary spaces, and that I believe have been buried or silenced. And this is the dominant narrative for Japanese Canadians, is that the standard one is that there were a lot of injustices done to loyal Japanese Canadians. And I think there's still an effort to undo wartime propaganda that really labeled them as a threat, national security threat. So there's an attempt to rewrite Japanese Canadians into the mainstream history. And in order to do that, there has been this distancing of anything to do with the Japanese language or Japan. Somehow that is a hindrance to this. And I think this is exacerbated by the particular situation in which Japanese Canadians were placed. So I just wanted to do a US-Canada comparison, since I think the case in the US is better known. I'd say the Japanese Canadians faced even harsher conditions overall. They were, first of all, disenfranchised. And unlike the Japanese American case, they were not able to show their loyalty through service in the military during World War II. And the families were separated as well. And the duration of the internment lasted longer, actually well into the post-war. So from 1942, they were moved mainly from the British Columbia to 100 miles inland, and then this was only removed in 1949. In addition to that, the land and the properties were confiscated and they were sold off in 1943. And not only were they dispossessed and forcefully removed in the 1942, they had this second, I suppose, forced removal. So they were given this choice in 1946 to either deport to Japan or to move east of the Rockies. So there's been more factors that contributed to this silencing. So recent research on this, there's been a project headed by the University of Victoria that brought together academics, people from the archives and community members that have really shown this Japanese Canadian history. And they have concentrated on quantifiable material loss. And they've relied primarily on English language records, which consists of mainly government records related to economic compensation, such as real estate land titles, case files of the custodian of enemy property, and legal cases. And so to me, like, this photograph is of the confiscated boats from 1941 of Japanese Canadian boats. And this symbolizes what has been well documented recently. What I am interested in is the intangible cultural loss, which I don't think has been talked about enough, given the pre-war vibrant culture, literary language spaces throughout North America. So, there were pre-war literary circles, news agencies, bookstores, literary library collections, etc. That, of course, they all shut down. 1941, language schools closed, newspapers banned, correspondences were censored. So there's a lack of Japanese language archival materials to really talk about this very much. And in addition, in Canada's case, there's the forced sale of properties and the dispersal, which makes it even harder. So my sort of project that I have in mind is to sort of recover this history. And I'm choosing this photograph. It's of a bookstore based in Vancouver, called Uchida Bookstore, and it lasted for a few decades. And there is the only photograph that I've really found is this one from 1907, which is sort of ironic in that this photo was taken during the anti-Asian riot in 1907 in Vancouver. So you can see like the store is vandalized. There's like the windows have been broken. And so this photo is taken so that they could document, I suppose, the amount of damage estimated at this time. So I'm sort of trying to demonstrate to you that the process of recovering the history of Uchida Bookstore as the focal point. And in order to do this, I have looked at some newspaper advertisements, which of course advertise the types of books that they carried, but interestingly, like this one here shows the different types of diaries, like a wide range of diaries that the bookstore carried, pocket-sized diaries, English language ones. So you can not only does it provide room to figure out what kind of books they were reading, but it also talks about you could figure out their reading and writing culture. A lot of things can be, I think, taken from these advertisements. This other one that I've, it's a biography, just a quote that's quite interesting as well. It's written by, it's written about the labor union organizer, and he mentions the bookstore in this biography. There was a bookstore on Powell Street, which is where Japantown was located in Vancouver, that used to sell translated socialist books. I read translations of some of Marx's books for the first time from that bookstore. That was around 1917, 1918, during the years when the labor union got started. So in the 1920s, the Japanese community here were also influenced by magazines like Liberation, Kaiho, and Renovation, Kaizo. So this also gives you a glimpse into possibly the social movements that might have been connected to the bookstore. Of course, there are other things like New Year's cards and fountain pens and other things that crop up in these advertisements. But I think what were these customers reading? This is quite interesting. So in addition to the diaries that they sold, they had practical dictionaries, Japanese English, Japanese dictionaries, popular novels. But I think it was very famous for having newly published books and monthly magazines. And there's a wide range of the content is interesting. For example, in the Taisho period, in the 1912 to 26, the new books included actually Christian diplomat Nitobe Inazo's work, like Today's Word, and Russo-Japanese War General Nogi's memoir, and Ozaki Yukio, the politician, who was quite anti-military, his works, his speeches rather. And then the monthly magazines, there's a huge range, like there were children's magazines, women's magazines, business magazines, opinion magazines, and literary magazines, as well as satirical comic magazines like Tokyo Pakku, or more general interest ones like Taiyo, the Sun, or Chuo Koron, Central Review. And yeah, very sort of, feminist works like Blue Stocking, Seto. So you get a glimpse of what was in circulation at the time. And of course, in the 1930s, this changes, as it moves towards more nationalistic content. But there's still quite a range of books that were interesting in the 1930s, like the one here, Kagawa Toyohiko, a Christian social reformer. His works. There's one by Utsunomiya Kyo, who wrote about Jewish problems and Japan, and he was actually quite critical of the Nazi treatment of Jews, and he was trying to promote a quarter, like a Jewish quarter in Shanghai, for example. And yeah, so this gives you a little bit of an idea as to what they were reading, but then I'm going to then talk about the process of destruction of this bookstore. So there's usually this sudden rupture in 1941, like everything Japanese, it was flourishing, and then the war, and then suddenly everything was in English, and the books were discarded. And I'm looking at the process of destruction using the custodian case files for one of the owners of Uchida Bookstore. And from the viewpoint of the custodian of enemy properties. These Japanese language books really are a nuisance because in contrast to furniture or things that they could sell, they really didn't know what to do with this these books that they didn't see any value, they couldn't read them, and they were considered, okay, they were, for example, this was 2 tons of 5,000 books, considered as a serious fire hazard. So the bookstore owner was given the choice of either to pay for storage, pay for the books to be shipped back to the owner, or pay for them to be burnt. Like you need to pay for the incinerator, or he opted for the last option, which was to sell them for scrap paper in the end. So that is the process of destruction. And then I was trying to sort of contextualize this. So within a larger sort of North American context, and this is where I used Hoji Shimbun. So, and it was very useful. Other people's talks on Hawaii and other places explains this partly. But the closing and reopening of bookstores in North America, I could figure it out that there were 3 in Hawaii that reopened after the war, 2 in California that reopened, and some of these actually remained intact, it seems, during the war, in contrast to the Canadian, the Vancouver case. I also wanted to look at the process of building collections or preserving these literary spaces during the war. One of which I found was the case in Hawaii. And I'm talking about the ones outside of internment camps, the Japanese language library collections. And this one I found was trying to establish in 1932, which amounted to about 10,000 books. And the 3 points there are the reasons for establishing this library collection. And the first one, for other ethnicities to research Japan, was quite interesting to me because I think it suggests, again, possibly, this is 1930s, and I'm thinking of Japan's cultural policy in China, for example. So there might have been this, again, orchestrated from Japan, some connections there. There's also a Japanese language collection in Vancouver that was evacuated during the war to the internment camps. This had a very different origin. It originated earlier in the 1910s and established for a different reason. But I am still trying to contextualize this better. And this is where I would like to ask people for feedback on or suggestions. So the larger picture, I am looking at the pre-war and wartime Japanese language literary spaces in Canada, and I'm using pre-war and wartime newspapers, looking at censorship, the act of diary writing, and the production, including haiku, for example. So the reading and writing culture inside internment camps, and Japanese language library collection, and related to that, education, I suppose Japanese language education. And I'm wondering whether I really should be looking beyond North America and looking at Japan's empire building and these global social movements, as I have listened to all the speakers today and yesterday's talk as well. And also on the literature on displacement in general. Also the history of book burning and destruction in conflict zones. But this is becoming a very large sort of, there are too many things to look at possibly, but this is where I'm at. I'm still at the very initial stages of my research. So any feedback you might have would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kato. So we are going to have a Q&A session. So anybody has a question, raise your hand. Okay, and yeah, Andrew.
Thank you for presenting in a previous fashion about the state of destruction of literary archives.
My question is a comparative one, which is that one significant difference between Canadian and U.S. Incarceration and internment appears to be literary activities within internment sites. So within the scholarship about literature of Japanese incarceration in the United States, there's also been a discussion of an accidental reafflorescence or convergence of many poets who were working via correspondence and suddenly were all in the same place with lots of idle time on their hands to pursue literary arts. So I'm curious if there's a cognate phenomenon in Canada, or if the divergence in internment conditions and the kind of extreme difference in, say, pay for your own storage or destruction also compromise that route of preservation or reafflorescence of cultural activities.
Should I answer directly? Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you very much for your question. Yes, indeed. I think there's much more of a continuation in the US case, and there were, I think, literary production was actually permitted, and they were within internment camps. These were published, so there is trace that continuity. But in Canada's case, I know of haiku that was produced, but there's very little. That's why I'm thinking that you need to go into private diaries and possibly some of the camp newsletters. But there is this real disconnect
just because of the different policies and conditions.
Yeah, also I wanted to ask a question. So when you were searching for ways of situating your study, one thing that struck me is a possible comparison or contrast with the treatment of German culture, at least in the United States. And I don't know what happened in the First World War, Canada, but it sounds like a somewhat similar story in terms of the outcome on American life itself, which is that languages start to disappear. So we know about the German case in World War I. I mean, obviously then, where all these towns in Wisconsin and places like that, where business of everyday business was conducted in German. Public records were in German, and then after 1918, it disappears. And it's one of the reasons why Americans today don't speak languages, because these languages disappear. And is it similar to, I mean, I now see that it's a US-Canada contrast, which I didn't know about, but is it a similar story in terms of the outcome of, this is like one more step in the disappearance of languages in North America?
I haven't looked at the German and American case per se, but sorry, I'm trying to figure out how I should answer this question. This disappearance of languages, whether that is part of a larger phenomenon or beyond. Well, my argument here is that it was, the Japanese language. There must be it would be the same, similar in the US as well, right? The Japanese language. But I have to think about how this could be, not just specifically this Canadian case and Japanese language, but how this might be a larger phenomenon in other situations when, of course, another regime takes over, or how languages disappear. Of course, in the Canadian case, the residential schools are another case in point where, cultural, the genocide as per se, but that was a policy in which the indigenous languages were taken away. That's so, I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question, but thank you very much for your feedback.
Just relating to that,
Yeah.
German case that bunch of Midwestern state passed down by German school laws. So I think that, and also you mentioned like the state policy laws,
Mm,
it's actually sort of bad. I think that's another important part.
okay.
And your point about the importance of war, right? I mean, this case, war actually made Japanese language de facto sort of legal. I think that's the kind of sort of thing going on. But German case, I think the World War I, an American response to, and local level passing anti-German school laws. And so I think that has a lot, and of course the Germans have some internalized that, like, hey, we have to stay away from that this heritage thing. So I think that all those things are gone.
I have a comment from Andrew Baltimore from University of Hawaii. So there are a number of scholars who are interested in literature space, and he particularly he's been working in the case in Hawaii. But so the Canadian addition would be very much welcome to the scholarly circle.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, I have questions to both Andre and Linda, with you guys. The papers are fascinating. And my side problem is the history of California rights. So it's great at walking you. First, I have two questions to both of you. The first question is, how did pre-migration knowledge of farming merge with the new modern agricultural knowledge in Japanese farming community? The second question is about the consular network. How, like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and consular networks were involved in the circulation of new, knowledge about machines, agricultural machines, or new plants that could be cultivated in the sphere of that have, the Japanese might have some influence.
Yeah, I can go first. Okay. Well, for the first question, how migration knowledge like, merged with the new knowledge. I didn't have time to talk about this, but there is a really interesting, fascinating project of cooperation and it transfers knowledge both from the local communities of the Amazon to the Japanese scholars, actually, because they didn't know the local environment of the Amazon, and also depending if you are near the river or inside, it's very, very different. Seasonal, the rises and decreases of the water. It's a whole new world, and there's also fascinating research about this kind of knowledge transfer done in Brazil, by Brazilian geographers, which is really fascinating that it's translated either in Japanese or in English. So I really learned a lot from those colleagues in Brazil. But yes, you have to look and at on the one side, today I just focus on this kind of imperial link or transnational. You have also to look to this kind of very local knowledge transfer, and many times they arrive with like practically little or to zero knowledge about their local environment. So pre-migration knowledge about local about farming was in many cases regarded as not as much relevant, would be forgotten and constructed through this kind of experimentations and research that I showed, but also with the transfer in the negotiations with the local society, which is another point, which is not as it's fairly undocumented practically, but you have to look to ways to know about this. And networks, well, as I've shown, you have these like networks of officials in there, like the colonization, Ministry of Colonization, and it's kind of businessmen that like perceive this this project as kind of a meeting foster economic expansionism, and that were pretty much, I would say, like informal networks, which is some restricted
kind of support from these officials, but that, as I said, it was connecting business leaders with officials that in themselves helped to transplant seeds to the Amazon. I have to look. I have to get to look more into that to be more specific.
I think that in terms of the kind of pre-migration knowledge of Japanese agriculture, I think that for the work that I've done, I think that there was definitely a belief that this would transfer. And I think that we could kind of, some of the examples I showed, but rice production was always kind of advertised as a thing that kind of Japanese exclave communities were going to be doing successfully. Whether or not they did was a different story. But I think that there was definitely a belief that type of knowledge was, and Brazil is an emigration destination, was always very much predicated on this idea that the sort of mechanics of farming in Japan, or an earlier version of Japan, were going to be continuous to a life in Brazil, right? One of the things that I found very interesting, and I guess I didn't mention this in the talk, was that when I'm talking about the mechanization of agriculture, one of the main reasons why the Japanese state becomes so excited about the prospect of sending people to Brazil is that the justification is that capital-intensive agriculture has come to Japan, and Brazil remains a very labor demanding agricultural economy. And so the kind of antiquated forms of Japanese rural life would then kind of translate well to a Brazilian context. In addition, all of the propaganda was kind of saying, right, that rice and crops that you were familiar with, the climates match up. But the reality was very different at times. And there were a lot of failed attempts to bring rice, but there's also sort of a lot of successes. And I think a lot of the secondary literature in Japanese about Japanese Brazilian history talks about this, right? That there's kind of entries in the Kakunenshi and everything about individual crops, right? So you can read about kaki or whatever, right? Or persimmons that we, in Portuguese are called kaki, right? And these are things that are brought by the Japanese. So I think that there's definitely some linkages there. In terms of consular networks, the place that I really want to look at, and I can't find a lot of documentation about, is the mechanics of the kind of cooperatives in the exclave communities, right? If you look at Bastos, or you look at Iguape, right? That these are kind of economic cooperatives that are helping farmers. And in theory, that should also include some sort of support and capitalization from either the Japanese government or Japanese state institutions. And so I'd really like to learn kind of like how agronomists traveled and trained people. And I know that there was an experimental farm that the Overseas Development Company ran, but I haven't been able to find kind of any details about what exactly they did or how they trained people to become kind of independent farmers during the 1920s and 30s. But I think that's kind of the next steps of this research, is kind of getting really into how that training and knowledge transfer happened.
I have a question from Professor Mariko Mizuno from Toyama University for Dr. Sato. She was wondering if there has been any previous research done on the destruction of bookstores or the memory of pre-war bookstores in Canada.
I don't think so. Yeah.
I'll deal with somebody with a question before, but yes. All right. So, sorry for this topic. Thank you again for your talk. Within the Japanese literary sphere in Canada you were discussing, have you looked into all the literary production of Nisei in the pre-war period? Because and if we're going to expand, one of your questions was expanding beyond North America, and if that at all made it to Japan, because I know in the Hawaii context, 1940, among all the fanfare of the 2600th anniversary of the Japanese imperial legacy, there are booths set up, stalls set up for Nisei, and their haikus and their poems and their essays are just displayed for people to go and see. I know of one, I'm looking at it right now. One thing that's called the Pacific Language Education Exhibit in 1937, very specific, but this is like a compilation of essays from around all of Nikkei communities, into which 15 Japanese language schools from Canada contributed. So these kind of Nisei production might be the window into not only your own kind of the literary space, but also international.
Okay,
It's a question and a comment kind of at the same time.
right. No, I haven't specifically looked at Nisei production, and you're talking about also like English language, or just everything Japanese language,
I'm
right?
not thinking Japanese.
Right, okay.
particularly,
Okay.
But
Not the
English
English.
language would be interesting as well.
Right,
if
but
that's
specifically. Thank you very much for the comment.
Well, maybe we can take one question. Yeah, so Andrew, you have more questions?
Sure. This continues about the affordances of borderlands. So in the two talks about agricultural knowledge transfer, but I understand the strong desire to think through textual sources. But of course, you're also mentioning informal, like migration leakage from Peru into Brazil, which shouldn't happen, but nevertheless is crucial for thinking about rubber development. Or in one of the slides, Andre, that you provided, like we have evidence of what was it? The whole Kodo, like the illegal conduct of colonists, and I'm kind of curious about what that is. I think the connection to Malcolm's paper is that thinking about the pre-war Canada-U.S. border through like the Cornell, Channing, Pacific Borderlands framework might be helpful because I've seen a little bit of Pacific Northwest U.S. Poetry circles doing correspondence exchange. So occasionally Vancouver or even like in Alberta, address will show up. So there's like because of the relative porosity of the border and the lack of obeying it in terms of thinking about literary exchange, that might be one kind of window to look in. But I'm curious about what your all's reading strategies for looking at the pressure against authorized knowledge transfer or border control mechanisms for thinking about diffusion of knowledge or literature. What the areas of leakage and pressure against them.
Okay, if I make it first, then yes, you mentioned that, but I think the question is related to how we look to the Amazon as a region, rather as a transnational region that comprises not just Brazil, but a large portion of South America, many countries, and there is I think you can see the Amazon as a kind of a dispute border and dispute frontier between multiple nation states and multiple also empires. If you look at British Guiana, French Guiana, Suriname. So in the process of nation building, not just in Brazil, but in the Amazon, during the late 19th century, you have a lot of borders, conflicts of borders between different countries. There's a region of ongoing conflict even today. And I think the Amazon region has been conceived by the state power as a frontier and as as a geopolitical weak point, which in different periods will be made a case for the necessity of strengthening state power, what happened in the Vargas period, which I mentioned. So that is so I think how do these in this frontier region, it's interesting to see how the Japanese businessmen or entrepreneurs saw as an opportunity to develop a frontier of an next leg of Japanese economic expansion there. Like they were probably regarding that place as a terra nullius, as a place with no state power, but in reality what they encountered was the reassertment of the Ordinary authority that indeed appropriated those processes. So yeah, that will be how a region is constructed and how this this borderland is disputed and how the Ordinary state tries to mobilize Japanese project of expansion. That is more or less my strategy.
Sort of as a stray observation, I think it's also interesting that even today, right, the Amazon, once it's sort of created as a unique space in the world, right, is supposedly other countries can make claims to it about how it should be treated and how it should be preserved in a way that I think very few regions of the world kind of have. But to kind of answer that question, I think that there's a couple different ways that I think one of them kind of goes, one of the answers I would give kind of goes to the kind of very spirit of like using these newspapers and sources as things. It's a very, I think, in some ways, it's a lot of projection in terms of how we understand who is reading these newspapers, who is reading these agricultural materials. And I think that we often, you know, the fact that they're published and they circulate often leads us to believe that maybe they're more popular or widely read than maybe they were. But I think that this is one of the fundamental problems of, I mean, difficulties that all historians face, but particularly historians of immigration, where oftentimes when you're dealing with immigrants who aren't producing a large number of written sources, then we end up privileging, right, the sources that we have. And I was kind of talking about this with someone yesterday, but maybe the idea is, right, that the agricultural production itself is the kind of source or thing that is left, right, that the Japanese in Brazil and the Brazilian government do spend a lot of time and effort calculating how much of what goods and commodities are being produced, where they're going, where they're being sent. And that is pretty good evidence, I think, historically in the record of what individuals were kind of doing. Where we go with that, I think, is another question, but we can kind of see how these commodities change. But in terms of also answering your question about sort of leakages or kind of the transcending of sort of forms of knowledge or maybe resistance, is, you know, I think one of the things that can't be lost is that there's a continually growing, from the earliest moments, urban Japanese Brazilian population as well, right? That a lot of people have kind of lost interest in farming, whether it's because it's increasingly difficult to do, or the promises that they were made were very difficult, or the price of coffee kind of falls apart, right? That these are, and then you get into those kind of like illegal acts, whether they're being done by the overseers of the plantation or by the contract laborers themselves. And so I think that, you know, in putting the kind of agriculturalist perspective back into these sources, I think I don't want to overcorrect to the point that we kind of forget that there are a very sort of like literary or merchant class that is happening in an urban setting that's not dealing with agriculture in this way, though I would argue that from the advertisements and things for hotels and various things, that they are still depending on Japanese agricultural wealth, whether it's like people buying their products and those types of things. But yeah, I guess that if that would be my answer to the question.
I have a comment and question from Professor Mirko Tari at University of Hawaii. In this section, and then both section and also the previous section, the Okinawan immigrants seem to be unnamed and buried in the account of Japanese immigration. She's wondering much of what in this session Andre and Hakundo presented today is also about Okinawan immigrants and immigration of the cultural communities in Brazil.
Okay, may go first. In the cases I presented today, I focused in two specific cases, which they didn't have much people coming from Okinawa. Actually, if you look at the case of the Nantak of Tomasu, today you have a great part of the families in Tomasu have origins in Hokkaido or Tohoku region, which is we have this kind of regional setting. So many of the families have their origins there, and also in the Amazon Industrial Institute, it's more dispersed origins, but tend to be like middle class to upper class families in central Japan. So I think there is in the Amazonian region, opposed to the rest of Brazil, Latin America, the Okinawan immigrants are a minority in terms of the actual people who were to them. So that makes me very difficult to talk about people of Okinawa, because they don't appear in the sources, because they weren't that much migrating to the Amazon. So in that case, yes, we have to, I can, that's why they don't come up in my talk, because they aren't in the sources, and we're migrating to other places. That will be my answer.
I would also say that in the sources that I've looked at so far, that there hasn't been sort of explicit reference to Okinawans as being different from kind of the audience that these materials were written for. I would say, however, that it would be really fascinating, especially in the context of kind of thinking about tropical agriculture or kind of warm weather agriculture, I guess, since Sao Paulo is not properly tropical, but where kind of agricultural knowledge from Okinawa and other kind of parts of the Japanese Empire that are warmer would kind of play into the colonization. And that's something that I hope to kind of be able to track in the next stages of this project. Because I think that these, you know, even we talk a lot about Nitobe all weekend, but Nitobe himself, right, like goes to Taiwan and kind of is dealing with agriculture and sugar plantations and things. So I think that looking at these transnational connections might be a really useful way, and explicitly talking about Okinawa might be a way to kind of shed more light on these questions.
So thank you. So I think we have more questions from floor and online audience, but we can continue the discussion later. But let me close this session 3. So thank you so much for all of you. Yeah. So please be. So will we be back at 4:45?
Hello again. We are back here. This is a final discussion session. We will take questions from webinar participants. So if you have a question, please send away, and your question will be asked later. So let's see. We have about an hour and 15 minutes, so we should have enough time for all the questions. We're gonna have questions from webinar, and also the participant here, and also the panelists, if you have any questions amongst each other. But before engaging in actual intellectual exchange, I like to ask the session chairs to share their sort of comments or observations. They're specialized in their own expertise, and they're coming, you know, so I asked them to actually share their comments as an expert on whatever they are specialized in. So maybe I'm going to ask Professor Kotani first.
So I consider myself ill-fitting at this conference. This is actually the second time that I participate in the JEI workshop. I do not do studies of immigration. I'm a historian of international criminal justice. So I really don't belong here. But I do want to participate in this workshop to learn something out of it. Now, so as I attended 2 workshops, I've been thinking of having an understanding of the history of Japanese diaspora. But when I come across this word diaspora, I think of those people who were subject to political persecution of a massive scale in the way of Armenian people or in the way of the Jewish population. The Japanese are never subject to those kinds of persecution that we know about with these people. So when we do use this word diaspora, but what we are actually looking at is the history of settler colonialism of the Japanese people during the age of imperialism. That's my understanding, and it is a history that I am interested, it's from that perspective that I've been listening to various presentations. There are a couple of things that stood out to me. Number one, it is a history of settler colonialism that could have lasted forever had it not been for this abrupt interference of World War II. Had there not been that, we would have had a different story of each of these settler colonies across the globe. So that's number one. Number two, we many of you are interested in telling the story of this abrupt intervention, interruption that World War II had upon the lives of those individuals, and the trauma that caused on these colonial settler colonies. At least some of you would like to tell the story. Moreover, I'm learning that you want to tell the story of trauma that was carried over intergenerationally. And I find this story fascinating. Number three, many of you, if not all of you, pointing out that because of this sudden interruption by World War II, settler colonies had to tell the story that of Japanese, now one might use the word diaspora, but the Japanese history of migration in a different way. They had to recast it because this war was the one caused by the home country. So they had to review, reassess, and recast and tell a new story of where they are coming from. I see that many of you are shedding light on this part of the history. And at the same time, you are trying to unpack and kind of demystify and challenge that story, because you know that that recast story is not the whole truth. So, and from your repacking, and this is my point number 4, you have brought to light a number of many interesting and different stories, but the stories thematically does stand out the following. Ethnic citizenry is a term used by Rashad, and I thought that was a good one. The Japanese at the a host country tried to establish their citizenship in a cultural way while maintaining their ethnic identity. We learned that that kind of activity was quite commonplace, although each colonial settler community has its own interpretation of acting on this idea. Number 2, another theme that stood up to me was ethnic nationalism. It's less accommodating, it's more exclusionist kind of theme that has arisen from the historical experiences of Japanese migration and settler colonialism. And the third theme that stood out to me is the diversity of experience from within. It's not just geographical differences, but there are class differences. The point made by one of my colleagues from Hawaii just a short while ago was a good point. Okinawan was one of the major ethnic groups within the Japanese diaspora community that figures quite prominently. There are also Japanese population moving out of their home country from different parts of Japan, but not at the entire archipelago. Is usually concentrated in Hiroshima or some parts of Kyushu, etc., etc. So what does it tell us about the people who do decide to come out of Japan? This another group of subgroup of the Japanese people that must be in the back of many of your minds, but not mentioned during today's session was Guraku, those of the former outcast community. It'll be interesting to have a conversation on, again, the diversity of the migrant population from within. That leads me to make an effort to connect what you're doing and what I'm doing. Again, I'm total novice and have no expertise in any of what you do, but I do come here because I want to learn something. And from a standpoint of someone who's interested in international justice. And I try to think about not only things that are inherently interesting as research topics, but things that may be relevant to what I do and what we do more broadly today, present day relevance. I'm interested in that kind of thing. So so the three themes that that came out of this conference: ethnic citizenry, ethnic nationalism, and diversity of migrant population from within. These things I think are thematically of interest to many of us, because irrespective of what drove the Japanese people out of their home territory, I mean, many of them have some of these experiences of ethnic citizenry, ethnic nationalism, and diversity from within, just the way that those who are displaced in the world today have today. So let's say those from Ukraine or from Syria or whatever. These are diaspora populations proper. And how the Japanese migrated are it's quite different. In any event, ethnic citizenry, ethnic nationalism, and the diversity or conflicts from within, rather. These have themes of contemporary relevance and will be relevant to my own area of interest. So in this discussion session, if any of you have anything to contribute on these kinds of topics, I'd like to hear. That's
right. Thank you, Professor Totten. As a workshop chair, I shouldn't be really kind of interjecting myself, but then I just need to say something about diaspora idea, I guess. So this is not that concept that the panelists actually picked. They actually responded to that call for paper that the organizers actually put together. So I noticed some of you actually use the term diaspora in your presentation. Others actually either avoided or did not really use, right? So, but then this diaspora idea is fashionable actually, theoretically, right? Everybody use it, but without actually thinking about the meaning, right? Uncritically used all over the place. But your comment, Professor Totten's comment, is actually a very important thing to think about, because to my understanding, diaspora, it's important part of diaspora is a relationship between home, right? And then also that kind of people outside, right? And this case, home was empire, powerful empire, right? And then they had a choice to actually return, unlike colonized Koreans or colonized South Asians who, well, they could return, but they would become colonized subject, right? So it's different from Japanese actually going back to or going to Japan. But then, then what kind of diasporic connections that the Japanese had? So these are the things I think we, scholars of migration, need to actually think about, and we need to have our own sort of a response or explanation. So that's something I want you to kind of keep in mind. I always think about that as well. So I just needed to interject myself into this issue, but thank you. And then Professor Tsukuda.
Okay, so I actually realized when I came here, I was expected to represent the Imin Gakkai Japanese Association for Migration Studies. So I want to first talk about the significance of this workshop. And because I also one of the organizers, the first the workshop that the Imin Gakkai and Hoover worked together, and Andrew Leon, so he was one of the speakers at that time. That time we did everything online because of the COVID. But now I'm really glad to see the speakers in person, and this is a great opportunity to make connections and building networks. So, Professor Adama just mentioned about the term diaspora. So I'm going to go back some another fashionable term, transnational. And then drawing from my own research, I mentioned 2 points. It's going to be for possible development of research in Japanese diaspora using Japanese community newspapers. So since the so-called transnational term, many disciplines from humanities to social sciences have turned their eyes beyond national borders, focusing more on the flow of people, ideas, and commodities, and encouraging more scholars to use multiple language sources. The transnational turn aimed to deconstruct essentialist notions toward nation state and exceptionalism that each nation tends to embrace. So papers presented in this workshop are all products of the transnational turn of these decades. Their presentations show the variety of Japanese diasporic communities from the US mainland, Hawaii, Canada, Mexico, Brazil to the Dominican Republic, with unique relations to the host society and Japan and beyond. All presenters consulted multiple language sources, including English, Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese, and of course, Japanese. And the analysis challenged conventional nation-based frameworks that tend to regard ethnic Japanese as a mere subject of assimilation or exclusion in the host society. So each presenter sees Japanese immigrants and their communities as active agents who have been trying to find the better ways to survive within local, national, international politics and economy involving their homeland and host countries, and more. So in addition to this transnational framework, the increasing accessibility to fewer Japanese community sources greatly contributed to the studies. So digitization of the old precious sources collected from a variety of Japanese communities and the creation of online databases have revolutionized research methods. The Hoji Shimbun digital collection have provided an access to huge amount of rich resources wherever we are. So in this workshop, Andrew Nelson fully took advantage of this new technology, and I'm really surprised to how to analyze whole text. And so he analyzed specific political terms found in 10 newspapers of over 40-year length. How could we imagine such a research method? It's possible decades ago. So also the other presenters use the other resources, not only the article or the newspapers, but the advertisement and the thank you ads. So they show the variety of innovative ways to read and analyze different Japanese community newspapers. So now I'd like to point out 2 aspects for the development of research using Nikkei community newspapers. So I myself first started my research in contemporary Japanese communities with focus on the relationship between Japanese-speaking and English-speaking Nikkei. So the Japanese-speaking Nikkei mostly include post-war immigrants, but not only immigrants. That includes the Chuzai in business expats and students, and but they are basically primarily speaking Japanese. And as I said, English-speaking Nikkei, so they are the descendants of the Japanese immigrants, the Nisei, Sansei, Yonsei. So most of them do not understand Japanese language. So drawing from my own research, I point out the role of language of the Nikkei community media, and second, scholars' contribution to communities. So the first, overseas Japanese community media provide us with history and knowledge that are not found in mainstream media, but not just the contents, but the language of the media itself may tell us a lot about the Nikkei community of that time. So why did they write? And why did they publish in Japanese? And who are writers and who are supposed to be readers of the media? So the answers of that questions might sound obvious in the period of early immigration, but during the wartime, they were not allowed to publish in Japanese. In addition, as a native-born population grew, community newspapers became bilingual, adding a section in the local language. but contents of the Japanese section and the local language section were usually different. So what does the difference mean? And could we find any conflict in the contents between different language sections? Drawing from my own research, so I did some research about the controversy around the bestseller, the novel, The Futatsu no Sokoku, Two Homelands, written by Toyoko Yamasaki. So that the novel was published in 1983, and that became the NHK Taiga drama. But the broadcast of the Taiga drama was canceled in the US because of that was a readers movement was going on in the US. So there were I found some conflicts of the who supported the broadcast or who supported the cancellation of the broadcast within the Japanese community media. Between the kind of separation between the Japanese language and the English language section. So by considering the questions about the language, so we may be able to deepen our understanding about political circumstances surrounding Japanese immigrants and their intergroup relationships. So secondly, how can we scholars make productive contribution to current Japanese diasporic community through our studies? So the sources of research mostly came from overseas Nikkei community, even though contemporary Nikkei community is very different from the past ones. Can we still make some commitments to the contemporary community, and how? So there used to be so many overseas Japanese community newspapers, but now the number is shrinking. So why? So we scholars appreciate efforts of preserving precious documents of past Nikkei community. So we need to think about how and what we can give back to communities. So I want to finish my comments by reminding of last night's inspiring lecture, Professor Sheldon Gallon's. So Transnational Histories Manifesto, 3 C's, Connections, Comparison, Causality, and Transnational Learning. So even though migration is actually a transnational phenomenon, migration studies have often been divided by destination countries and also divided by disciplines, and not many attempts for comparative studies. So this workshop is a very special occasion that young scholars from different disciplines was focused on different areas in different time periods. So we can start to discuss how to overcome these divides. So how can we make connections and draw productive comparison between case studies of different countries, regions, and places? And how can we integrate them to draw the large picture of Japanese diaspora? So can we find any cases of transnational learning between Japanese diasporic communities? I think there should be many transnational learning cases. And also the division lies between pre-war and post-war periods. Continuity of Japanese migrations from pre-war to post-war is often overlooked, even though Japan resumed the immigration policy to the Caribbean and South America after the war, and have been sending migrants until 1970s. In North America, post-war Japanese immigrants, post-war migrants have been considered very different from pre-war immigrants, but existing networks between pre-war communities and homeland Japan helped the success of Japanese business in the US. So, recently transnationalism may begin to sound banal and overused, but actually we still have a lot of work to do. So I hope this workshop provided a great opportunity of making new scholarly connections and building academic networks in order to make our studies truly transnational. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Tsukuda. So now I like to open, I guess, we'll get the questions, and also actually we're gonna have exchange among ourselves and also the audience as well. So any question? I'll start with the professor. You have the honor.
So I'm gonna ask a very naive question, because I still don't know much about the field, but having all of you together, sheds light on a question that I thought I knew the answer to, and I don't. And that is motivations for Japanese to leave Japan, to go to these various places, in various times, in various spaces. You know, I mean, if you focus on America, you know, we just assume it's poor farmers with a sprinkling of few intellectuals come to America. But here we get cases that are very rich. Like I couldn't figure out this morning why these women in the Mexico case, why women who are working in textile and tobacco factories would decide to get on a ship and come to Mexicali to work in various forms of prostitution. I understand the motivation for that, and I also I just had never until fairly recently thought about South American migration, but the fact that it goes on fairly strongly, we saw in the Dominican Republic case, in the Brazil case, in the 1950s, when Japan isn't necessarily that poor. I mean, if it were 1946, I could see why people would want to leave Japan. But 1954, 1952, things are coming back, cities are rebuilding, and so all these motivations, I just wondered with everybody in this room with such collective knowledge, have we gotten further in establishing the variety of motivations?
I think it related to that Professor Totani's point about diversity too. So everybody's probably have something to contribute because you look at the different folks, right? But anyways, any response?
Thank you for your comment. I did there's the women in Mexico, right? So in the larger picture, the economic factor really mattered, but at the same time, if you look at the history of the picture bride, there are their own motivations. There are economic factors. But at the same time, there are women who wanted to see a different world, to be curious about a new life in America, and people were told that they're going to go to America, but actually it included Mexico, other parts of America, the large Americas. But anyway, so it's not just not only about economics, but also about their own agency to see a new world. And when it comes to the agency, I think the Professor Totani said that one of the important things about this field of study is looking at the diversity, right? So I think those kind of things is really important to highlight the agency for the people. And so we're looking at understanding the agency is one of the most important things of transnational history when it comes to migration study, because it shows the power structure between the individuals and the nation state. And nation state is right there, and you can see the power and violence and other things. But at the same time, as you said, there is a women who decided to go there. But in the case of my study, I talked today could be more like post migration element. But as I said in my paper, one of the women who were brought to Mexico decided to settle in Mexico. So I think it's important to look at that moment, right? To keep it as something important, because that could show some agency of the people. And looking at the agency is important in contemporary world, because if we understand, if we have to, we want to solve the problem faced by immigrants today in the world. In Japan, so many, nearly 3 million, foreign nationals are living there, including those who are born in Japan, right? So understanding the agency really resonates with today's importance to deal with the multiple issues related to immigration today.
I want to build on this and would like to ask everyone. So how many of you have as an analytical framework like human trafficking to explain this massive movement of people? I mean, the bulk of the Japanese who migrated in those years, decades, were part of the underclass population, right? And how they move from point A to point B seems very familiar to how people are being moved today from point A to point B, and that's called human trafficking. And the State Department now, since 2000 or so, annually writes trafficking in persons reports. And some of the things that they describe sounds exactly what has happened during in the context of the Empire of Japan. And we have had this conversation a little bit. And when I heard your presentation, I thought, this is like a classic example, Karayuki-san. But you are not talking about, Ameyuki-san. But you aren't presenting your topic from that perspective, saying that this was because this was rather unique case, that it galvanized this, it drew so much attention and set in motion the formation of a transporter Japanese, some migrant Japanese like collective identity thing. So I thought, wow, you think so different from me. But since my conversation with you in the recent past, you did mention that human trafficking is an important component of the movement of people. So please. Okay.
I mean, I'm not sure that I've kind of thought about it as human trafficking per se. I mean, I think that one of the things that I've kind of looked at is the difference between kind of what was promised to a lot of migrants by either migration companies or migration agents. And this is a big thing, I feel like in the literature, especially kind of there's the sort of moment in which, especially in the Brazilian context, where I think there's people who feel like they have, the Japanese is like state on right? So there's these kind of ideas of people that have been kind of thrown away by the state or the empire, depending on when they move. But I think that at times also, like, I don't want to eschew, I think, like recognizing though that Japan in the moments that this is happening is also undergoing tremendous upheaval, right? And especially rural Japan is undergoing. And it's not necessarily, I mean, a question of Japan will become wealth. I think that like a lot of times the way we think about Japanese migration is often overdetermined by Japan's sort of post-war economic success, right? But I think like if you're looking at 1920s Japan, especially 1920s Japan, especially from the standpoint of rural people in Japan, right? That it's not clear that Brazil is fundamentally that much different in terms of its economic potential or promise at that moment that Japan is. And so I think that there's oftentimes people who would, right, the struggle might not necessarily be staying in Japan and becoming wealthy materially under the context of sort of 70s and like 60s and 70s high-speed economic growth. The question is also if you're in rural Japan and all of a sudden everyone's moving to, you know, the local prefectural capital because there's a new spinning mill or factory or something, and that's also a type of upheaval that's happening that also kind of lends itself, I think, to narratives of human trafficking for those types of things. So I think that there's kind of I think that we need to be clear that Japan in the 1920s is very fundamentally different than Japan in the bubble or the 1980s, right? And even the 60s and 70s. But in terms of human trafficking, I think we can look more comparatively globally at the way that kind of human migration tends to work, right? And a lot of times, I think, you know, we tend to look at migration decisions as being deeply kind of inscrutable or hard to understand. And, you know, that's what we're dealing with, right? This question of sort of structure versus individual agency, individual choice. And I mean, there's work, I think of Bill Nabashi's work, Survival of the Native, which is mostly about network theory, but like the types of decisions and the kind of like links and things that are made kind of are really difficult to kind of explain on a broad scale, but then when you look deeply, you can kind of see what is causing these types of individual immigration decisions to be made. And so I think we need to kind of make sense of that and also recognize kind of a broader set of global facts about how immigration happens, especially internationally.
Building upon that, I should be quiet, but then I think that I actually use the term human trafficking in my work actually, but starting with that immigrant, right? And that's tied to the capitalism actually. A lot of domestic capitalists are connected to that, shipping company or that, right? But then turning into, you mentioned kaiko, right? And then kind of state sort of a kind of became sort of an immigrant, immigration company in a way, right? So sort of capitalism and also the state. But at the same time, they also use the flowery term like, "kaigai hatten," etc., colonial sort of a kind of slogan, right? And then, so then a lot of sort of, labor migrants, right, kind of embrace that idea and then justify their pursuit of self-interest in terms of this contribution to this expanding Japan kind of thing, right? So but then there was this machine sending a bunch of people from rural Japan. So in that sense, it's kind of human trafficking, a little different from that typical definition of human trafficking we have. But then, there was a machine, a sort of ideological kind of thing going on. But then at the same time, as you mentioned, and you mentioned too, but the people actually had a power to actually adapt the language and justify their pursuit of a little bit of money working on the plantation and such too. So the agency there. So it's actually, that's how I see that this human trafficking issue and in relation to the state power capitalism, but then also agency people actually had. The agency actually included the kind of embrace of this language of imperialism and expansionism, right? So I think that's another thing I'm kind of interested in, this whole sort of a structure and then kind of agency issue too.
To maybe connect Professor Tafani and Tsukura's comments together, both thinking about contributions to contemporary Japanese American or Japanese overseas, it's slightly strange for us to use, but communities and the questions of that might be raised by thinking about national criminal justice. I'm thinking now, at least within the state of California, because of the Reparations Commission, that some of the most pressing issues for, say, like a Japanese American progressive left are ways of having a dialogue over the history of redress and reparations movements and reparations for slavery and exclusion in California. This is a kind of test model. And this raises a lot of recurrent and difficult questions about just how much historians should speak up about when and where Japanese were settled colonists and maybe not the noble victims of incarceration. And it also maybe, it would be helpful to add into this conversation about human trafficking of the state chronological framework. Thinking about Paul Takagi and Ruth Gilmore's work on the production of the systematic production of surplus population, which I think also connects maybe with another presenter of the last overseas migration workshop, Sydney Liu's work on the construction of the idea of not losing surplus population and the idea that there are disposable populations that need to be released out into other nations, which is at least an ideological framework for explaining mass migration. And it's pairing with shadow, at least in the state of California and elsewhere, it's mass incarceration. That's one framework about Japanese American incarceration in particular and its continuation. State sanctioned modes of identifying individual criminality as a way to ensure a locked prison.
Yeah, I have a question from a remote participant based in Japan. Thank you very much for very interesting presentation. She's wondering how what you study would be integrated into and connected to the Japanese national history.
I think the way that I look at it is that Japanese national history, the extension of which should include at least partly the Japanese overseas community as well. And I think that when we look at least in my case, I look at Japanese imperial institutions, individuals, and others who came back and forth across the Pacific during this time period, talking about Japanese national history is, to a certain extent, you're kind of doing it a disservice if you don't include its influence beyond the territory of the empire.
Only about this point, yes, considering that the Japanese state might have a very active policy, migration policy of sending people be involved in outward migration up until the 1970s, and still continuing kind of diaspora engagement policies for the indigenous community. I think that should be another way in which it's a topic that should be addressed as an issue of Japanese national history, how the state was involved actively in this migration and policies of migration, which I think this connects to the operation we were discussing about how this machine for sending people resemble much of human trafficking and how they actually the human rights of the immigrants were vulnerable, such as we see some of the cases of the Dominican Republic when actually the Japanese states and the policy and sending migrants in a condition that actually violating the human rights. And we should remember that that was just one case, but if you look to many other agricultural settlements built to South America between the 1950s and 1960s, you will find that the vast majority of them now are really unpopulated or have mostly disappeared because most of the people left in the first years because it was an unviable situation that we saw in the Dominican Republic. Pretty much the same in our country, so that but at that time that was justified, as I briefly mentioned in my presentation, in the language of development, to mention as to the contribution to development of the state and the state itself implementing a policy of national development. So at that time was very much this idea. I think it connects also to an idea of an excess of population, that transfer that as a workforce needed for the development of the third world, thing that comes up and being a human rights issue in military. So in the case of the Dominican Republic, it developed in a lawsuit, but you look at different cases in different settlements, you will find pretty much similar consequences. And this, again, as a state, as a result of state policy, so that's another issue which should be addressed as talk about history, national history.
I mean, flipping this question is, Midori-san, you actually kind of tracing Japanese Dominican or the Japanese in the Dominican Republic's race politics, basically, right? So, and actually, I think that's the first time I heard about it. I mean, all I hear about Japanese in Dominican Republic, they are like a kimin, the typical kimin, abandoned by Japanese state. That's the own Japan-centered perspective, right? But first time I heard about the, kind of interesting position that the Japanese in Dominican Republic actually occupy in local race relation, which is completely different from North America. So, and then of course that the, Andres project, and also that, Facundo too, actually have the Brazilian context as important as tied to Japan too. So like contribution to maybe like Brazilian history in context, and then Dominican Republic history context, or like a Mexican history too, right? So that's a sort of extension of that question I like to kind of ask, if you have any response, because this is the beauty of, I think, the study of migration. I don't use diaspora term here. It actually, have the power to bring these different places and then make contribution to those places, right? Because people move and then create the connections. And it's not just connections, but also, they actually stay in particular country or nation state and contribute or participate in the local society building, nation building, economics, and so forth. So not just Japan, but then also the other sides are also important. But just wanted to add this question to that question from audience.
Now we do want to invite all of you to ask questions that you meant to ask, but we just ran out of time. And we also would like to encourage you to think about cases comparatively. So far, like the one who's most unfit to be here is speaking quite a bit, but this discussion session is meant for you to ask questions to one another. or propose a new one for us. So I saw Rashad raising her hand earlier, but I'd like to ask others also to contribute. That's our plan, wasn't it?
Yeah. So please. Because you
Oh, yeah, my comment was on that, Explorer and whether or not we should be using it. And I mean, I'm not gonna argue for or against it, but I think one of the things that we talked about the relationship with homeland. I think one of the things that we've all established by being here is that also it's important is the relationship with other diaspora communities within a diaspora. Because when you say diaspora, it creates a one community in a way. And I think it's just as important as consciousness with the homeland in relation to the homeland, air quotes for everything, is a diasporic consciousness that emerges and institutional connections that potentially find the diaspora in a way. And I personally tend to not use that word in terms of in my research with its connection, but I mean there are obviously kinds. So that was my comment earlier. So and I think that institutions like the publishing collections bringing people together are evidence of that intersectional relationships across.
And we also would like to invite the remote participants to ask questions.
So I have a question from a remote participant. How do we move this interdisciplinary, transnational research forward? What are the sort of practical devices you would suggest, like maybe open access scholarly journal, or what would be useful forum or device going forward to promote interdisciplinary transnational research?
idea, hope.
I mean, more projects like the Hoover collection, to be honest, as open access as we can be, and having a wide variety of resources that, the fact that, I can go and read a newspaper in Brazil and in Peru and in, Hawaii, open my laptop home, great. And these kinds of resources are extremely important in developing and we talked last night, or people talked about the technological advances and how that's facilitated this kind of research so much more. And you're giving me a wish list. I mean, that would be great if more so across the board. But, institutionally speaking, interdisciplinary dialogue and exchange, and not being afraid to go outside of your institutional background. Historians tend to talk to historians and anthropologists talk to and us being in this room is evidence of productivity from one process works.
Like if you publish your work, where would you think to actually submit? I mean, that's the question I always ask myself, because I do kind of eclectic sort of idiosyncratic thing. It's not really Japanese history. It's not quite that American history. What the hell, right? So that, kind of curious what you're actually thinking about where you can actually publish.
My proposal, I think, to answer the previous question actually, was I think that there needs to be more kind of ways to publish across languages. And I think that this kind of goes to Professor Tsuda's question about kind of dealing with local communities. I think it's, especially as someone who's an American-based academic, and I think about this a lot as a public historian, it's kind of like, how do I bring my kind of foreign expertise to bear on the communities, make that accessible to the communities. I worry that at times the work that we're doing is extractive in a way that's not one in which we're creating kind of equal partnerships with the people and the academics. Like, I don't know a ton of people. I think it's very difficult to be, someone who works transnationally, super conversant in 3 different languages, kind of like secondary literatures, when I'm also using primary sources in a number of different languages. And so I think if there's kind of immediate, kind of methods to publish across languages, that's something that will take time and effort, I think, to translate things. But in an ideal world, I think we would be publishing in some sort of journal that would also put it in the languages of the people that we're hoping to converse with. because like this is a rare occasion in which we're speaking to people in Japan, and we speak to people in Japan a lot when we do research, but we don't necessarily present our research to people in Japan. We would like.
So with this in mind, there's a little bit of thinking, Rashad, about your presentation in particular of imagining the Nikkei citizenship, or but not as like national registration or kokuseki, but as maybe something like shimin-sei, like a civic ethic, makes me reflect also on what Aisha was saying about the dangers of diaspora. And there's also a kind of inbuilt danger of automatically assuming a translation between Nikkei-ness and diaspora, which neglects, Rashad, what precisely you identified, which is a genealogy or history about how Nikkei concepts are tied to an emergent form of like some kind of international, local civic awareness. And that also makes me think about the more recent uses of Nikkei and things like the International Nikkei Research Project in the 1990s, 2000s incarnation of what we're doing, and then outgrowths as far as we're talking about, Andre, of discovering there is a public-facing tri or quadrilingual venue. I both celebrate its existence and also am wary about what it would mean to publish academic or scholarly work for the junior scholars in particular, who might need some degree of protection and also peer review from just putting something out into the internet to be read by overseas Japanese communities in Argentina, Brazil, United States, and Canada. I mean, it's a public-facing audience. It integrates well, but if you're writing it all about a question that is historically traumatic, politically sensitive, all of those things might speak to the fact that there are existing models, there are existing fora, but it might be very helpful what gaps exist between those forums and what venues might be most welcome for junior scholars to communicate.
So I think it's so easy to fall within the gaps, right? And I mean, your question of publishing begins even earlier, because of funding for us as like scholars, like where you get funding from. What I've found at least is that I kind of, and I don't know if this is my advice or not, but kind of take it as the best of both worlds and say I can apply for funding for like American focused stuff or Hawaii focused stuff. I can apply for Japan focused stuff. I can apply for funding American focused stuff, and these kinds of things. Obviously, you tweak your application, you tweak your essays a little bit depending on your audience. But I think, at least for me, I see it as an abundance of riches as opposed to being halfway in any way, shape, or form. I hope that answers, but that's my reflection on your comment.
So I have a question for the group. I have a question for the group. I'm saying it loud. So transnational, interdisciplinary, these are running themes of this conference, right? And that's why you are together here. So having participated in this conference, do you get the sense that, yes, this is what I was looking for? I have been trying to be transnational and interdisciplinary, or maybe one of the two. And now having attended this conference, I get the confirmation that I'm in the right direction. Or did you come across something that you had not thought about? What is, in other words, what is your takeaway from this workshop? I'd like to hear from at least those who haven't spoken yet. Ladies or gentlemen. Midori?
Yeah, so this is my first conference. And my topic is quite niche, as you can see, with the Japanese DR. I'm very fond of studying because the knowledge is quite small. But I would say, yes, I was looking at the other perspective, this idea of Japanese diaspora as well, in different contexts, and how it translates, where the similarities, where the differences, and how even using similar materials can result in such different types of research as well. I think it's very interesting. My focus is more on the Latin American studies. So I'm trying to create this bridge between what is like East Asian studies, Japanese studies, with Latin American studies and Caribbean studies. It's not very easy. It's difficult to find it, so I can actually create a bridge. So I sort of interject myself, even if it's supposed to be Japanese effort, I'm gonna have the Latin American part in the Japanese classroom. But it's still important to have a very much more broad perspective on those that are as it's not usually the whole. So yeah, I'll go back.
How about you, Dr. Shibata? You are a bit of an anomaly coming from a sociology background, highly theoretical. It was very inspiring, but
well, so most of the letters come from history, history background. Yeah, that's the question. What actually from history of details about the effort, especially for high social and even social balance. But we tend to focus on the framework after and the whole story, and then we can ignore details in the event. So yeah, and then I use the history as a secondary literature. But so yeah. But what I want to learn in this conference is like what kind of framework historians have to when they in their research project, and then I kind of struggle to figure out what their framework.
yes, there's a reason for that. We are kind of a bit fuzzy.
Go backward in a way. We kind of resist the generalization, that kind of sort of a theorization that social sciences.
We want to be implicit with analytical frameworks to avoid attacks.
Yeah, and also we like to look at nuances and gray areas and stuff, right? Which actually I think that our theories kind of have difficulty capturing in a way. But then we are not really good at actually giving sort of a general kind of perspective in a way, bringing different places, right?
Professor Garen, who's like a top person in this field, history, Japanese history. Maybe he has something to offer to you as to his takeaway. What to be learned from historians.
Methodology is very different than certainly. So you're a sociologist? Yeah. I guess the history are still. They still talk to each other. I learned a lot. At the same time, we have sociology in this book. Political science has been a field that's really spun out from history. 30 years ago, historians of political science talk all the time. It's very good. It's a shame. And maybe this is said. There was a sort of historians find that political science often theorizes, overgeneralizes, and it's sort of oblivious to when you point that
think it was. So that's what we are. I don't. I did want to say one thing though about the British point, which I thought was really interesting about. So when I heard the Japanese diaspora, I was thinking of, well, okay, it's an interesting concept, but are we falling into the trap of all these ethnocentric histories? And I think of like Jewish studies, and a lot of the problem with Jewish studies in its earlier generations were they also just saw diaspora, and they didn't see any contact between Jews and their local societies. And so I think the Joyce's paper really, brings that out, and a lot of papers do. But that interaction is interesting. And so, where are we? Well, you've got to have a balance between the sort of, the settler colonialism and the diaspora. It's a really good model, and it gets us from, being every of me, but it gets us out of this bind of Asian American history. People land on the West Coast, and the next day they become Americans. Okay, so we don't like that history. So thinking and making these lateral linkages, that's really good. But we also don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and forget that Japanese people do settle in all these places, and there's an interaction with the locals. So we just have to know. It's not one or the other.
Well, since the Professor Totani started this sort of graduate seminar way of make everybody speak, and there are a few people who haven't opened their mouths quite yet at this session. So how about Shinya? Because building on that, what Professor Gyan said, your work actually kind of look at the connection to China between Chinese and Japanese, right, and local race relations and such. So.
Yeah. Okay. If you ask me, well, rather than the data away from this, the context of presentation, this is, well, I'm afraid that my comments is a bit offensive to you, but well, I'm a Chinese self-proclaimed Americanist, and in the field of the U.S. history, there's the academic field, the U.S. history in the world, and I think that that this the content of presentation. I can say that, oh, this is the Japanese history in the world, so modern Japanese history in the world. But is it possible to understand the Japanese history in the world without considering Asia? So I guess Professor Abdullah would also make a quick extension to the the Asian the East Asian history by connecting the Japanese America with Manchuria and Taiwan, right? And the recent book that I read. Well, in line with that schema is Professor Professor Michael James state well anyway that actually the book discussed that today instead of experience in the history of Japan. And I think that I would like to say, well, I'm there to say that we might want to take more look at Asia rather than the history of America, or let's take let's cast our eyes more
That's what American is saying. That's wonderful to hear.
Yeah, I can't have to make a dissent with that comment. Coming from I'm based in Japan. I'm born most of my academic career in Japan. So if you look at the Japanese language, like in migration history, initially it's like that. Because it was very like centered in the Japanese community. And sometimes you feel like they're quite an exclave, and no other people are living there. So the relations with like the local communities, I think I've learned in the study of this in Japanese language, migration history, which is where I have has been very insufficient. So that's why I believe that the connection that we was talking about, like connecting like Latin American studies and like this kind of Japanese migration studies or Asian diaspora studies, if you want to look at the broader picture of migration in Latin America, it's also very important that has done in other many academic fields. So I think that was actually could be a very critical intervention in the sense that not much has been done yet of that. So that's probably, at least in the context of the, I think the Japanese immigrant, I think more research is needed actually on that, and looking to the relationship between the Japanese communities and the local society, and between the class, gender, and many different types of interrelations that happen. But there's more research actually doing that.
I think it's very important issue. This is an international conference, and people are actually coming from different nationalized academias. Academia is very much still nationalized, right? And then this international crossing thing is very rare. I mean, we're having it, but then all kind of problems and so forth, right? And so that baggage we don't really talk about, right? So, and we don't actually know about. I mean, just your exchange showed that in the US is helplessly nationalized and then kind of, in one way. In Japan, of course, everything is about Japan, or extension of Japan, Asia, or something. So I think that we need to kind of think about those differences, where we are coming from, and then we're going to go back to those places, nationalized spaces, right? And then we can actually, we need to actually fight the battle different ways. But then, so yeah, that's, I think, that kind of highly nationalized structure of academia in a different countries, right? I think that's something to kind of think about. And that's all the more reason why this kind of sort of an endeavor, international sort of exchange, we kind of get out of that sort of a nationalized space and we can actually talk about the problem, right? I think that's very important. That would be my takeaway.
Don't you have a closing statement to make?
Yeah, we still have time. We have time.
In 10 minutes we are done, right?
Oh, 6. I have 5 minutes, but we have 5 minutes, but then there are 2 people who have opened their mouths, I think, right?
Who forced them?
Dr. Kato and then Akiki, yeah.
Also.
No, I think this was really exactly what I was looking for this workshop, because I was trying to contextualize something very like actually study of a particular, enclosed space. And then now I'm beginning to see all the connections between all the different, studying different locations, which I didn't really see the connection until I came to this workshop. So in terms of contextualization and I guess interregional, like within the diaspora, like the connections that I've seen. So I'm so thankful for bringing people together, and I wish there was a journal or something, or like more opportunities like this, because I usually fall between disciplinary cracks of like library information science, like Greek culture, or like East Asian history. Yeah, so all these disciplinary and also the things that are published in Japanese versus English. So I think the fact that this archival collection brings all these together actually brings all the scholars obviously as well together. So thank you very much.
So Kiki and then Andrew Nelson.
Oh, I'm sure.
I don't know.
He will be the last one.
Okay. Think.
Oh, yeah. Realized that, I was educated in several colonialism. Just like, I realized that they were to like in mindset. I realized that I used that several colonialism as my in my journal articles and stuff, but I didn't realize that that discipline kind of like a novel of my school, and today I presented the very, very novel case study and stuff. But this workshop gave me the more like I should broaden my scope, the professor got that yesterday, and maybe I could like compare the experiences of like Caribbean institutes or Alaska institutes or other places. Maybe they, there are few people got interned and they probably like return afterwards. So maybe I could have that, and maybe I could like the more degree on the differences between like the pro-Japanese or like for US state people who got interned at like return to apply immunity and what they did after the war and how their occupation affected us in my time. So I really appreciate all of you to remind them.
Yes.
I appreciate the question. What we found we were looking for to come here. And, you come across something that you hadn't thought of, and made me think, what was I looking for? I had never really considered my research to be transsectional before yesterday, actually. And it was really thanks to Professor Garrett's presentation that I realized, oh wow, flows of ideas across national borders is exactly what I was doing. I just didn't have that name for it. I think I've been really privileged to lively play in this sandbox of information. I really appreciate all of Dr. Veda's support and help from Hoover. I've also benefited, and I really regret not thinking of them during the presentation, the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis here at Stanford, which allowed me to start with a body of data, which was this evolution collection, and observe it as an object and wonder, what is this telling me? Which leads to the question, what would I need to know to understand this object that I'm looking at? And then that evolves into questions of scale and scope. What are the feature sets that constitute any object as an object or an actor as an actor that's worthy of examination? And then it starts to get into questions of, well, is language the thing, the constitutive element that defines an object? Is it national origin? Is it industry? Is it role? Is it privilege? And I think the answers to those questions are what start to get us into, oh, this is transnational, or oh, this is national history, or oh, this is that. So I think that all of these to me, these categories and what I've found here today, they're just different refractions of the same object, shuffling those defining variables in somewhat different ways, and they give us a multi-perspective. So what did I get from today? I really appreciate, I have a new appreciation for the flow of knowledge and the shared lightweight that our actors in this taking. I think starting to see, I'm still new to this field, but starting to see an evolution from an examination of objects, an examination of flows, contacts, and we're getting to the point of reverberation where we see these things and bouncing back and forth over time. We're ultimately humanists, so we're interested in what humans experience, and all of the ways that we look at that today start to answer that eternal question.
Thank you. Well, I guess yeah, I have this obligatory thing that I need to do to end this wonderful exchange, and I'm sure you're tired and hungry too, right? So yeah, just let me just handle this part, and you'll be free. And well, as a workshop chair, I have the honor of concluding this intellectually stimulating discussion session and the day-long workshop itself. First, I'd like to thank all the session panelists who shared their ongoing research that examine various aspects of the global Japanese diasporas from many different perspectives. Their interventions and new contributions cross not only boundaries of nation states and regions like East Asia, North America, South America, but their critical perspectives illuminate the differences and intersections of disciplinary approaches. Talk about history and then sociology and literary studies and such, right? When I started, my own research that aspired to cross boundaries between Japanese American history and Japanese history, and between US ethnic studies and Asian area studies, by looking at trans-Pacific Japanese mobility and migrant settler making, my endeavor was a lonely one about 30 years ago. But as we witnessed and then heard today here, this field is now fast growing and booming with rising youngsters or young scholars, right, who are breaking new grounds with their respective cutting edge research. I may sound like an old man, I'm getting old anyway, but I am really happy to see Japanese migration and diasporic studies are getting more legitimatized, I think. Not enough, but intellectually sophisticated and making more meaningful connections to the conventional fields of academic research, like diplomacy, geopolitics, area studies, and race and ethnic studies, history of science and technology, among others, across national and regional boundaries. Diasporic studies, when they are done well, can address a variety of issues that speak to scholars of other fields, like Professor Tota. And good diasporic studies can also offer fresh perspectives and new frames of interpretation that scholars of more established fields might not have been able to imagine. Of course, the fact that the migration and diasporic studies can make those meaningful connections to the conventional fields of academic studies also means that scholars must be aware of and familiar with what are at stake in those established fields, whether they are diplomatic history, international relations, education history, or studies of race and ethnic relations, or those studies of nationalism or nation making. Our panelists have presented such sensible and overarching works even when they focus on specific themes tied to specific nation states and areas like Japan, Brazil, US, Dominican Republic, Canada, Hawaii, or Mexico. Studies of diaspora migrations inherently involves movements of peoples, ideas, technologies, monies, and goods, commodities between and across the different regimes of power and legal systems, markets, nationalized societies and cultures, race and ethnic relations, and political economies. When many of us are interested in trans this, trans that, or transcending and crossing the boundaries that divide our disciplines and regional concentrations, studies of diasporas and migrations are essential to that sort of border crossing intellectual labor, I say. When the 10 thought-provoking research projects before us, I must say I am very optimistic and excited about the future course of Japanese migration and diaspora studies. I would also like to add my observations that the questions we received from for panelists today would help them, your works, sharpen their argument and engage in more research to cover broader grounds and address more questions they have not thought about till today, right? And you already kind of talked about it. So for this reason, I believe that this workshop proved to be beneficial for young scholars and myself too. Well, so in concluding my concluding remarks, I like to emphasize the importance of institutional support. We actually talk about that too, right? And this is a place we could actually share these ideas. This is the institution we need, right? So, so I need to actually emphasize the importance of the institutional support for our idiosyncratic endeavors that even exist in the interstices of the established field of academic studies. The key institutional sponsors today are Japanese Association for Migration Studies and the Hoover Institution. And this workshop is also supported by the endowed Japanese Diaspora Initiative. And many individuals from these institutions and others have also contributed. Even though it is impossible to acknowledge all of them, please allow me to mention some key individuals. Dr. Yasuko Takezawa, president of the Japanese Association for Migration Studies, and Dr. Eric Joaquin, deputy director of Hoover Institution. The selection and program committee for this workshop consists of Drs. Yoko Tsukuda, Mariko Iijima, and Mariko Mizuno. We're not here, but they actually are part of the selection committee. And they're all from the Japanese Association for Migration Studies. And Drs. Yuma Totani, and then Kei Kaoru Ueda, and as well as myself from Hoover Institution. I just wanted to add that we had the 28 applications. Wonderful project, actually. Choosing participants for this workshop was difficult because there are so many excellent research projects. So, and then you guys are actually an elite group of people who were selected, okay? And so this reinforced my earlier comment that the future of this field seems to be very bright. Right? Along with Drs. Tsukuda and then Totani, Professor Jun Uchida of Stanford University also kindly accepted the request to serve as a session chair today. She's now teaching a graduate seminar, so she can't be here, but she's going to join us at the dinner, right? So we can talk to her. Then we are also fortunate to have the distinguished historian of Japan and global history, Dr. Sheldon Gallon of Princeton University, kick off our intellectual exchange yesterday with his thought-provoking keynote lecture. Thank you. Now, despite the lingering effect of the pandemic, the complicated logistics for this international hybrid workshop were ably handled by many staffs of Hoover Institution. They are Yumi Higa, Leah Limchenko, Michelle Arroyo, Janet Smith, Miriam Birabardo, Chris Kim, and Hiromi Okuzawa. And of course, I cannot thank Dr. Kei Kaoru Ueda enough for doing most of the heavy labor for this to happen. And but not the least, I like to thank all the panelists, of course, and the audience in the back, and also that cyberspace somewhere, right? For making this workshop a success. Panelists, I look forward to reading the fruits of your research in print soon somewhere, some journal or books, right? And I hope this workshop serves as a start of similar endeavor to showcase what younger generation of scholars can offer for this new and exciting field called the global Japanese diasporic studies. So thank you very much.